The auctioneer's gavel had not yet fallen when Effie Whitfield raised her paddle a second time, and the entire town of Redemption Creek, Texas, held its collective breath in the summer heat of 1882. She stood at the back of the crowd gathered outside the First National Bank of Redemption Creek, her cream-colored blouse pressed perfectly despite the dust that hung in the air like a fine curtain, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shaded eyes the color of deep river water. She was 26 years old, sharp as a tack, and she had ridden 3 days from San Antonio to be here for one purpose and one purpose alone: the Thatcher Ranch. 4,000 acres of prime Texas hill country land, sitting on the bend of the Llano River, with clean water rights and good limestone soil. It had everything her father's cattle company needed to expand its operations westward, and Effie had studied every survey map and water table record the county assessor's office possessed before climbing into her carriage and making the journey north. This was not a romantic notion. This was not sentiment. This was business, pure and straightforward, the kind her father had trusted her to handle ever since her mother passed, and she took over the administrative side of Whitfield Cattle Company at the age of 22. What she had not prepared for was Silas Thatcher himself. She had heard the story in fragments on her way through town. The ranch had belonged to his father, a man named Edmund Thatcher, who had built it from raw scrub and sheer determination over 30 years. Edmund had died the previous winter of a bad chest, and Silas, his only son, had inherited the land along with a debt that Edmund had quietly accumulated against it. A note held by Harlan Creed, the banker, for $12,000 that had come due 6 months ago. Silas had tried to negotiate, tried to make payment arrangements, but Harlan Creed was not a man who operated on goodwill, and so the foreclosure auction had been set, and now here they all stood. Effie had not expected to lay eyes on the man before the bidding began. She had expected a legal proceeding, papers and numbers, not the sight of Silas Thatcher standing off to the left of the crowd with his hat in his hands and his jaw set like stone. He was 30 years old, tall in the way that men who work land tend to be tall, not theatrical about it, just solid and real, with shoulders that belonged to someone who had spent his whole life throwing hay bales and setting fence posts. His hair was dark brown and somewhat too long for propriety, curling at the edges where the Texas sun had lightened it slightly, and his face was tanned deeply and honestly. He was not handsome in the easy, uncomplicated way of a man who had never struggled. He was handsome in the way of something weathered and enduring, like old good wood that had been through seasons and come out stronger for it. He was watching the auctioneer with an expression that Effie, from her distance, could not fully read. It was not anger, though it could have been. It was something quieter and more devastating. It was the expression of a man watching something he loved be taken from him and not knowing how to stop it. Effie looked away. She had a job to do. The bidding opened at $8,000, which was well below market value for the land, and everyone in the crowd knew it. Harlan Creed stood near the bank's front steps in his pale linen suit, looking self-satisfied in a way that turned Effie's stomach slightly, though she could not afford to have an opinion about local politics. She was here to acquire land. The first bid came from a cattle speculator out of Austin named Portsmouth. He was heavyset, sweating through his collar, and he raised his paddle with the bored confidence of a man who assumed he would win. Effie bid $400 above him. Portsmouth countered. She raised again. They went back and forth 3 times before Portsmouth hesitated, mopped his face with a kerchief, and dropped out at $10,200. Then a second man entered the bidding, a land agent from Houston who had clearly been sent by someone with deep pockets, because he jumped $500 at a time without flinching. Effie matched him methodically. The crowd was murmuring now. People were turning to look at her, trying to work out who she was and where she had come from, and she could feel the weight of their curiosity like a second layer of heat. She did not look at Silas Thatcher again. She could not afford to. The bid climbed to $13,000, then $14,000, then touched 15,000 and the Houston agent's paddle went still. He conferred with a man beside him in a low voice, shook his head, and sat down. Effie's paddle was the only one left in the air. The auctioneer raised his gavel, going once at $15,200 to the lady from San Antonio, going twice, 16,000. The voice cut through the August air like a cold current in a hot river, and the entire assembly turned. Silas Thatcher had not moved from his spot on the edge of the crowd. He had put his hat back on his head, and he was looking directly at the auctioneer with a calm that seemed to cost him something considerable to maintain. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir, do you have the funds available to? I have a bank draft from First Cattleman's Bank of Careville for $11,000 in my coat pocket," Silas said, his voice carrying easily in the stunned quiet. "And I have $4,000 in certified cash money being held in escrow at the same institution. My attorney in Careville can confirm the total within the hour if needed, $16,000. Harlan Creed's expression had shifted from self-satisfaction to something more complex and not entirely pleased. "The debt on the property is $12,000, Thatcher. You couldn't scrape together. This isn't a conversation between you and me, Harlan," Silas said evenly. "It's an auction. Those are two different things." The auctioneer, a thin man named Forsyth who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat carefully. "The bid stands at 16,000. Do I have 16,200? Every head swiveled to Effie. She was standing very still. She was also doing rapid arithmetic in her head. She had authorization from her father for up to 16,000, which had seemed more than generous given the land's assessed value. Her paddle was in her hand. She could raise it. She could go to 16.5, possibly 16.8 if she was willing to send a telegraph to her father and wait for his reply, which would take the better part of a day and would almost certainly break the procedural requirements of the auction. But it was not the arithmetic that was stopping her. It was the look she had made the mistake of finally giving Silas Thatcher, just at the moment his bid hung in the air. He was not looking at her with anger, which she could have withstood. He was not looking at her with pleading, which she might have been able to dismiss. He was looking at her with the full, unguarded recognition of a man who understood exactly what she was here to do and was not going to pretend otherwise. And in his dark eyes, beneath the exhaustion and the grief and the stubborn dignity of a man at the end of his rope, there was something that she could only describe as the last ember of a fire that refused to go out. Her paddle did not move. "Going once at 16,000, Forsyth said. "Going twice." He paused, looking at Effie one more time. She was looking at Silas. "Sold at $16,000 to Silas Thatcher." The gavel came down. The crowd erupted in noise. Some of it was surprise, some of it was the particular pleasure that small towns take in watching the unexpected happen. Harlan Creed was speaking rapidly to his assistant. The Houston land agent was already walking to his horse, and Effie Whitfield was standing in the August heat with a lowered paddle and a feeling in her chest that she could not immediately classify. She had come here for a ranch. She had left with nothing but the questions she had never thought to ask. She went to the hotel that night, a clean, modest establishment called the Redemption Arms that smelled of wood smoke and lye soap, and sat at the small desk in her room with her ledger open in front of her. She wrote a careful letter to her father explaining that the acquisition had not been completed and that she would be returning to San Antonio within the week. She folded the letter. She did not seal it. Instead, she went to the window and looked out at the main street of Redemption Creek, which was settling into its evening routines. A few horses stood at the rail outside the saloon. A woman was calling her children in off the porch of the dry goods store. The light was going amber and long, the way hill country light does in August when the day finally begins to give up the fight. Down the street, she could see Silas Thatcher coming out of the bank. He had a leather satchel under one arm and his hat pulled low, and he walked the way he seemed to do everything with a quiet steadiness that did not announce itself. He paused on the boardwalk, looked up at the sky for a moment as though checking the weather, and then turned and walked toward the livery stable. Effie realized she had been watching him from the window for longer than was appropriate. She sealed her letter, set it on the desk for the morning mail, and went to bed. She did not sleep for some time. In the morning, she was at the hotel's small dining room before most of the other guests, eating biscuits and drinking coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, when the door opened and Silas Thatcher walked in. He saw her immediately. A small town's dining room at 7 in the morning did not offer much in the way of concealment. He nodded once, the polite acknowledgement of a man who had been raised to have manners even when things were difficult, and moved toward a table on the opposite side of the room. Effie watched him sit down. He ordered coffee. He took out a folded piece of paper from his coat and studied it with great concentration, in the manner of a man who was trying very hard not to look at someone. She picked up her coffee cup, carried it across the room, and sat down across from him. He looked up. "I believe," she said, "that I owe you an explanation." He looked at her steadily for a moment. Up close, the quality of his attention was considerable. It was not rude and it was not intrusive. It was simply very direct, the way an honest person's attention tends to be. "You don't owe me anything, Miss Whitfield, Effie Whitfield. My father runs Whitfield Cattle Company out of San Antonio." Something moved across his face. "Recognition, perhaps. I've heard of Whitfield cattle. Most people in the Texas cattle trade have," she said, not with pride, just with the same directness he was giving her. "I came here to buy your ranch. I want you to know that plainly. I had authorization for up to $16,000 and I let the bid go at 15.2 because—" She stopped. She had rehearsed this speech in her head since 4 in the morning and it was already not going the way she had planned. "Because why?" he said. "Because it was yours," she said. "And it was clear that it was yours in a way that doesn't translate to a number in a ledger, and I have spent the last 10 years of my life translating everything into ledger numbers, so that is saying something." The silence between them lasted long enough that the waitress came and refilled his coffee cup without either of them noticing. "My father built that ranch from 1849, he said finally. "He came to Texas with a wagon and a mule and $40 and he built it. I was born in the front room of the house there. I buried my mother out under the cedar trees on the East Ridge when I was 12 years old." He looked down at his coffee. "I wasn't about to let Harlan Creed sell it to a stranger for less than it was worth. That was a considerable risk," Effie said. "If I had raised my paddle, you didn't." "I didn't," she agreed. "Mr. Thatcher, I still need land. My father's company is looking to expand its range holdings significantly over the next 3 years, and the hill country is exactly the terrain we need. I'm going to be honest with you about that because it seems like the only reasonable approach." "You could have just gone home," he said, and there was the faintest edge in it, not hostile, just pointed. "I could have," she said, "but I think there might be a better arrangement than an outright purchase. I'd like to discuss the possibility of a grazing lease. Your land, our cattle, a fair annual payment that would help you manage that debt you're carrying." He was quiet for a moment. "You've done your research. It's my job. How much of the property are we talking about?" "The southern pasture sections, the 1,200 acres along the river bend. We don't need the whole ranch and you'd keep full title and control. We'd need water access guaranteed and we'd need a clause for renewable terms." He looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his thinking face, slightly narrowed eyes, a faint line between his brows. "Why would your father agree to a lease when he sent you here to buy?" "Because," Effie said, "I'm going to recommend it to him, and he generally trusts my recommendations." "And why would you recommend it?" She considered how honest to be. She was a businesswoman. She understood leverage and information and the strategic withholding of both. But there was something in his directness that made the usual calculations feel somehow insufficient. "Because a man who will spend every dollar, he has to keep the land his father built deserves to keep it," she said. "Because a grazing lease on 1,200 prime river acres will serve my company's needs just as well as ownership, and at a fraction of the capital cost." She paused. Also because it seemed like the right thing to do and I was raised to pay some attention to that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted, not a full smile, not yet, but the first indication that one was somewhere in the vicinity. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A land agent, someone in a suit, someone who'd come here to strip the place down to the soil and sell it off in parcels." "I'm wearing a suit," she said. "It's a different kind of suit," he said. Effie Whitfield had not blushed in a professional context since she was 19 years old. She was mortified to discover that this constituted a change in that record. They talked for 2 hours over coffee that morning, and by the time the dining room had emptied around them, they had the skeleton of an agreement sketched on the back of his folded piece of paper and on the margins of her leather notebook. He would need to consult with his attorney in Careville, a man named Solomon Webb who had helped him secure the bank draft, and she would need to send a telegraph to her father and await his reply. Both of these things would take at least 2 days. "There's a decent spot for fishing on the North Fork," Silas said as they stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel, squinting into the morning sun, "if you're the type to appreciate it." "I have work to do," she said. "So do I," he said. "But it's Sunday tomorrow and even work takes Sundays off out here. Or it should." She looked at him. "I'm not trying to flirt with you, Miss Whitfield," he said, and he said it with such plain, almost rueful honesty that it made her laugh, a genuine laugh, not a polite one. "I'm trying to thank you, in the best way I know how, which is showing you something worth seeing." "All right," she said. "Sunday morning, then." She sent her telegraph to her father. His reply came back the following afternoon, which was a Saturday, and it was characteristically brief. "Review lease terms carefully. Use your judgment. Trust your numbers. Father." She read it twice and felt the particular warmth that his confidence in her always produced. She spent Saturday working through the legal framework of the lease agreement in her room, cross-referencing with the survey maps she had brought from San Antonio and a land law reference book she kept in her travel trunk. She was meticulous. She was thorough. She caught herself twice looking out the window toward the south end of town, where she had been told the road to the Thatcher Ranch began. She went back to her papers both times. Sunday morning arrived with the particular gentleness that Texas summer mornings sometimes produce before the heat builds into its midday cruelty, a light that came in sideways and golden across the limestone ridges, a breeze from the north that smelled of cedar and something sweetly green. Silas was waiting outside the hotel at 7 o'clock with 2 horses already saddled, a calm gray mare for her and a big-boned chestnut gelding for himself. He had also, she noticed, brought a canvas bag that turned out to contain coffee in a battered tin pot wrapped in cloth to keep it warm, 2 tin cups, and a generous portion of cornbread wrapped in a clean towel. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know it," he said simply, and helped her onto the mare with the easy, natural courtesy of a man who did things because they were the right thing to do and not because he was performing them. They rode south out of town, and the landscape opened up around them the way hill country does when you get away from the buildings, vast and layered and luminous, the limestone outcroppings rising through the cedar and the live oak, the sky an impossible blue overhead. Effie had grown up in San Antonio, and she was not unfamiliar with the beauty of the Texas landscape, but there was something about this particular stretch of country that was different. It had a quality of specificity, of having been tended and known over time, that distinguished it from raw country. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. He talked for the better part of an hour as they rode, and she understood within the first few minutes that she was receiving something valuable, not the property description of a man trying to make a deal, but the genuine account of a man who knew every inch of a place because he had lived it. He told her where the deer crossed in the early morning, where the underground spring fed the southern pasture even in a dry summer, where the stone fence his father had built by hand in 1856 still stood perfectly level despite 3 decades of Texas weather. He told her about the cotton-tailed rabbits that had colonized the old root cellar, and the peregrine falcon that nested in the limestone face above the North Creek, and the particular stretch of river where the bass came up in the evenings and would take a fly with almost reckless enthusiasm. She asked questions, and he answered them with the same straightforward thoroughness he seemed to bring to everything. And somewhere in the middle of it, without either of them quite noting the moment, the conversation stopped being about the ranch and became something else. The kind of conversation that happens when two people who are both accustomed to not being fully seen by the world begin to suspect that they might be seen by each other. She told him about her father's company, about taking it over after her mother died, about the ledgers and the land surveys, and the cattle drives she had ridden on despite the raised eyebrows of every cattleman in 3 counties. She told him about learning to read contracts at 16 and to negotiate with bankers at 18 and to project 5-year land values at 20, and how none of it had been what anyone expected of her, and how she had done it anyway because the work mattered and she was good at it, and those 2 things together were enough. He listened the way he did everything else, completely, without hurry, without the dismissive half-attention she had learned to expect from men who had already decided what a woman was capable of. "You're good at it," he said. "That's not a guess. That agreement framework you sketched yesterday had terms that my attorney in Careville is going to have to work hard to improve. You read it. You left it on the table when you went to pay for the coffee," he said. "I wasn't prying. It was face up. What did you think of the water rights clause? I think you've protected your company's access well, and I think there's a natural negotiating point around the dry season minimum flow guarantee that we're going to spend some time on." She looked at him sideways from under her hat brim. "You know land law." "I know my land," he said. "That amounts to the same thing in practice." The North Fork of the river came into view through a gap in the cedar, and they rode down to it, hobbled the horses in the shade, and sat on a flat limestone shelf above the water that had been warmed by the morning sun to exactly the right temperature. He poured the coffee, still surprisingly warm, and she ate the cornbread, which was good, and they sat for a while without talking, watching the water move over the pale rocks in the particular silence that exists in places that have been peaceful for a long time. "I'm sorry about your father," she said finally. "I should have said that sooner." He looked at the water. "Edmund Thatcher was a hard man, not cruel but hard. He didn't say much that wasn't useful, and he didn't spend time on things he couldn't see a purpose for, but he built something real. He was quiet for a moment. He deserved to see me keep it. He would have seen it," she said. "The bid. I think he would have been proud." Silas turned to look at her, and the sunlight came across his face at that particular angle that the morning had been producing all day, and she saw something in him that she recognized because she had felt it herself, the weight of wanting to be equal to something that someone else had built, and the loneliness of carrying that weight alone. "Why aren't you married?" he said, and then seemed to surprise himself slightly, as though the question had arrived ahead of his intention. She did not take offense. "The men I've met in my professional life either can't accept what I do or they can't accept that I'm better at it than they are," she said, "and I haven't spent much time outside of my professional life. That's a lonely arrangement." "It's an honest one," she said. "Those don't have to be the same thing," he said. They stayed at the river until nearly noon, by which point the sun had gotten serious about its business, and the shade of the cedars was looking considerably more appealing than the limestone shelf. They rode back through the ranch property. He showed her the southern pasture with the ease of a man who had nothing to hide, and she looked at it with a surveyor's eye and found it exactly as good as the maps had suggested, and in some ways better, and arrived back in town in the early afternoon. He helped her down from the mare, and his hand was warm where it steadied her arm, and she was aware of the warmth for about 3 seconds longer than was strictly professional. "Monday morning," she said. "If you can have Solomon Webb review the draft by then, we can begin formal negotiations." "Monday morning," he agreed. "Miss Whitfield, Effie," she said, before she had entirely decided to. The corner of his mouth lifted again, fuller this time. "Effie," he said. "Thank you for Sunday. Thank you for the cornbread," she said. She walked into the hotel and did not look back until she was in the lobby, at which point she looked back through the glass of the front door and found him still standing by the horses, watching her go. And when their eyes met through the glass, he did not look away quickly or with embarrassment. He simply nodded once, the same way he had nodded that first morning in the dining room, polite, honest, entirely himself. She went upstairs and opened her ledger and wrote nothing in it for 20 minutes. Monday arrived with a thunderstorm that rolled in from the northwest in the early morning and settled over Redemption Creek with gray, determined persistence. The rain hammered the wooden boardwalks and turned the main street into a respectable river of red mud, and the whole town smelled of wet cedar and limestone, which Effie had decided was not an unpleasant smell. Solomon Webb arrived on the 10 o'clock stage from Careville, a small, quick man of perhaps 50 with spectacles and a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived several difficult decades. He was sharper than he looked, which was a quality Effie appreciated, and the three of them sat around a table in the hotel's private meeting room with the draft agreement between them and went through it clause by clause for 4 hours. Webb had comments on the water rights section, as Silas had predicted, and Effie held her position on the dry season minimum flow guarantee with a quiet precision that made Webb glance at Silas across the table with an expression that said, clearly, "Where did you find her?" Silas, for his part, said nothing, but there was a line of amusement around his mouth that he was doing a moderate job of concealing. By 2 o'clock they had resolved the water rights. By 3 they had worked through the grazing capacity limits, the fence maintenance obligations, the seasonal access provisions, and the renewal terms. By 4 the agreement was substantially complete, pending Effie's father's formal signature and the witnessing of the documents by a notary. Webb left to catch the return stage, shaking hands all around with the satisfied expression of a man who had done good work. Silas and Effie sat across from each other in the quiet room, the rain still running steadily down the window glass, the papers between them. "Your company is getting an excellent piece of river pasture at a fair price," Silas said. "Your ranch gets a reliable annual income that covers your debt service and leaves a margin besides," she said. "It's a good deal for both sides." "Is that why you're smiling?" he said. She had not been aware she was smiling. "I smile when a negotiation comes out right," she said. "I smile at that too," he said. "Among other things." She looked up from the papers. He was watching her with a directness that was different from his professional attention, warmer, more deliberate, and entirely without the quality of performance. It was the look of a man who had decided to say something real. "I'd like to take you to dinner tonight," he said, "not as the other party in a negotiation. Not as the owner of the ranch you came to buy, just as myself, if that's something you'd consider." The room was very quiet except for the rain. "The hotel dining room," she said. "There's a better option," he said. "Mrs. Garza on Pecan Street does supper for guests on Monday evenings, and her tamales are the best thing in Care County. I can promise you that. You've been there before. Mrs. Garza has fed me twice a week for the better part of 3 years," he said. "She'll be pleased to have a guest worth cooking for." Effie considered this. She considered it for perhaps 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than her honest answer required. "All right," she said. 7 o'clock. Mrs. Garza's house on Pecan Street was small and immaculate, built of whitewashed limestone with a porch wreathed in climbing roses that had made their armistice with the Texas heat and were blooming in deep red profusion despite the season. Inside, the table was set with a cloth embroidered in blue thread. There were candles, and the smell from the kitchen was extraordinary. Mrs. Garza herself was a woman of perhaps 60 who moved with the efficiency of someone who had been managing the world since before most people had worked out what it was. And she greeted Silas with the warmth of long familiarity and Effie with an assessment that was immediate and thorough, and concluded, apparently in Effie's favor, because she squeezed her hand and said "good," in a tone that seemed to encompass more than the pleasantry. They ate tamales and beans and rice, and a dessert made with piloncillo and cinnamon that Effie thought she might need to find the recipe for before she left Texas. They talked, and the talking was easy in the way that second-day conversation is easy between people who have already established that they are genuinely interested in each other's minds. He told her about the work of the ranch, the specifics of running cattle on hill country terrain, the rhythm of the seasons, the partnerships with neighboring ranchers who shared range and sometimes shared the work of roundup and branding. He described it without romance, just with the steady authority of a man who knew his work, and she listened with the same quality of attention she had given the survey maps and the water table records, because she was beginning to understand that this man and this land were the same study. She told him about San Antonio, the city as it was in 1882, growing fast and in all directions, the cattle trade shaping it even as the cattle trade itself was changing, the railroads arriving and shifting everything about how beef moved from ranch to market. She told him about the office on Commerce Street where she had spent the better part of 4 years reviewing contracts and building the company's land portfolio, and how she had ridden out personally to survey acquisitions because she did not fully trust anyone else to read a piece of ground the way she could. "You should have been a surveyor," he said. "I am a surveyor," she said. "I just don't have the credential." "That seems like an oversight someone should fix," he said. Texas didn't particularly see the need to credential women in land survey work in 1876 when I started doing it, she said. "I'm not entirely sure it sees the need now." "Then Texas is losing good work to stubbornness," he said. "Yes," she said. "It does that frequently." He walked her back to the hotel through the cooled and rain-washed night, and the main street of Redemption Creek was quiet and clean, the mud dried somewhat by the warm air that had moved in after the storm. The stars were immense over the hill country darkness, the kind of stars that San Antonio's growing lights had already begun to diminish. They stopped on the boardwalk outside the hotel. "How much longer will you be in Redemption Creek?" he said. "The notary comes through on Thursday," she said. "I need to be here for the signing. After that," she paused. "After that I should go home." "Should," he said. "I have work in San Antonio," she said. "There are 3 other properties my father wants assessed before the end of the year." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not," he stopped himself, reconsidered his words. "I would like it if Thursday was not the last day," he said. She was standing in the lamplight from the hotel's front window, and she was looking at him, and she was doing the kind of internal arithmetic that had nothing to do with acreage or water rights or lease terms, and the answer it kept producing was the same one every time. "I'll be here through Saturday," she said. "The company stage back to San Antonio doesn't leave until Saturday morning." "Saturday morning," he said, and something in the way he said it, not quite with relief, but with the particular quietness of a man who has just been given something he needed, made her chest do the thing it had been doing at irregular intervals since Sunday morning by the river. "Good night, Mr. Thatcher," she said. "Good night, Effie," he said. The rest of the week had the quality of time that knows it is running out, and behaves accordingly, vivid and unhurried, and threaded through, with a significance that ordinary time does not possess. On Tuesday she rode out to the south pasture with him, and walked the fence lines, and measured the flow of the river in the dry season channel with a stick, and noted everything in her book with the same methodical care she always brought to field work, while he watched her work and did not try to make it easier or more difficult, just walked alongside her as an equal. On Wednesday evening, there was a social at the Methodist Church, a supper gathering of the kind that small towns in 1882 organized with some regularity for reasons that were partly community cohesion, and partly the simple human need to not sit alone. And Silas arrived at her hotel and asked, with a slight formality that she found genuinely charming, if she would accompany him. She agreed, and they sat together at a long table with half the town of Redemption Creek, and she talked with the ranchers' wives about land and cattle and weather with the ease of long practice, while Silas talked with the men about the same things. And they were at opposite ends of the table, but she was aware of exactly where he was every moment. After supper there was dancing, a fiddle player and a man with an accordion who understood their purpose, and Silas appeared at her elbow with a hand extended and an expression that was hopeful and somewhat careful. She had not danced since her mother's birthday, 6 years ago. She took his hand. He danced with the same quality he had everything else, not showy, not awkward, just present and sure, and his hand at her waist was steady, and they were close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and smell cedar and clean linen, and the particular warm-skinned smell of a man who worked outdoors, and she thought that she was in some kind of trouble that she had not adequately prepared for in all her survey maps and legal reference books. "You're a decent dancer," he said. "My mother insisted," she said. She felt it was important to be able to present well in any social situation. I think she had a different application in mind than hill country church socials. "I think it works in all applications," he said. They danced twice and then stood at the edge of the room with the people who needed to breathe for a moment, and his shoulder was near her shoulder, and the room was warm and lit with oil lamps and full of the specific kind of comfort that comes from being in a place where people know each other well. "What does it feel like," she said, "to live somewhere where everyone knows your name?" "Sometimes it's a weight," he said honestly. "Sometimes it's the thing that keeps you standing." She thought about Commerce Street in San Antonio, where everyone knew her name in a professional context, and almost no one knew anything else. "I think I've been missing the second part," she said. "It's not too late to find it," he said. She looked at him. In the lamp-warm room, with the fiddle going and the smell of pie from the kitchen and the sounds of a community that had known itself for 30 years all around them, Silas Thatcher was looking at her with an expression that was no longer guarded or careful or professionally assessed. He was looking at her the way you look at something you want and are afraid to want too much. She reached out and took his hand, deliberately, fingers threading through his. He looked down at their joined hands and then back up at her, and his expression shifted into something simpler and more open than she had seen on him yet. They stood like that for a long time, and the fiddle played, and the evening went on around them. Thursday the notary came, a tall woman named Harriet Lund who rode the circuit between 6 hill country towns every month and handled more legal paperwork than most men with offices and secretaries. She reviewed the lease agreement with a thoroughness that Effie approved of, asked 3 pointed questions, received 3 satisfactory answers, and witnessed the signatures of both parties with the competent calm of someone who had been doing this since before most of the current signatories had been born. Harlan Creed was not present for the signing. Effie had not expected him to be, and when she mentioned it to Silas afterward, he said simply that Creed's opinion of the proceedings was not something he was prepared to spend energy on. The debt on the ranch was serviced. The land was secured. The rest was Harlan Creed's own disappointment to manage. They ate lunch at the hotel after the signing, and it was different from the first lunch, which had been careful and transactional, because now the business was concluded and what remained between them was not the agreement on the papers, but the more complicated and considerably more interesting agreement that had been developing since Sunday morning on a limestone shelf above the North Fork. "I need to ask you something," Silas said, setting down his fork. "All right," she said. "When you go back to San Antonio on Saturday," he said, is that the end of this?" The directness of it was characteristic, and she had come, in 4 days, to value it extraordinarily. She could have given him a professional answer. She could have said something about the lease requiring annual visits and maintaining contact with the lessee. All of it would have been true, and none of it would have been the truth. "No," she said, "it isn't." He let out a breath that told her he had been holding it. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "In a practical sense, you're in San Antonio and I'm here and the work doesn't relocate for either of us." "No," she agreed. But San Antonio is 3 days' ride, which is not an impossible distance for someone with a horse and a reason to travel. And the telegraph exists, he said. And the postal service, she said. And the lease requires annual review, he said. That it does, she said. He was smiling properly now, which she was discovering she found unreasonably satisfying. I'm going to court you, he said, with the plain declaration of a man who had decided something and saw no reason to be oblique about it. I want you to know that's what I intend. I'm going to do it correctly, and I'm going to do it at the pace that the distance allows, and I am going to try to be worth it, Effie. She looked at him across the hotel lunch table, with the afternoon light coming through the windows and the noise of Redemption Creek going on outside, and she thought about the paddle she had lowered in the auction yard 4 days ago, and the moment she had looked at his face and made a decision that had not been in any ledger or survey map. You already are, she said. Friday was the last full day. He took her to see the ranch properly, not the southern pasture sections that would be in the lease, but the whole of it, riding through from the river boundary in the south to the limestone ridge in the north, through stands of live oak and cedar, past the stone fences his father had built, past the family cemetery on the east ridge where his mother lay under a cedar tree that had grown large in the 30 years since her death, past the spring-fed stock pond that stayed clear and cold even in August. And finally to the house itself. The house was built of cut limestone like everything in this country, solid and low, and shaped by the logic of people who understood wind and heat. It had a porch that looked south toward the river, and there were roses beside the front steps, an old rosebush, canebrake thick, that his mother had planted the first year and that had survived everything since. There was a kitchen garden behind, somewhat neglected in the months since Edmund's death, and an enormous live oak in the yard that had to be older than the ranch itself. It needs work, Silas said, looking at it with the honest eye of a man who saw both what it was and what it had been. It's beautiful, Effie said, and meant it entirely. He showed her the inside, which was plain and well-made, and had the feel of a house that had been lived in by serious people. There was a stone fireplace in the main room, a solid table and chairs, shelves of books that surprised her. Her surprise must have showed because he said, Edmund wasn't a talkative man, but he read. What did he read? History mostly, natural history, some novels. He had a complete set of Dickens that he'd ordered from a bookshop in Austin and that he claimed not to enjoy but read 4 times through. She pulled out a copy of Bleak House from the shelf and turned it over in her hands. The spine was worn with genuine use. Keep it, he said. He'd like the idea of it being read again. She held the book and looked at him in the afternoon light in his father's house, and the feeling in her chest was so large and so complicated that she did not immediately have language for it. It was not entirely unlike the feeling she got standing at the edge of a piece of land that was exactly what it needed to be, a profound and settling recognition that something was right. She put the book carefully in her bag. They sat on the south porch as the evening came in, and she watched the river through the trees in the distance, and he brought coffee from the kitchen, and they talked until the stars were out and the cicadas were in full voice in the cedar. She told him about her mother, a woman from Virginia who had come to Texas at 18 and never quite stopped being surprised by it and who had loved it anyway, who had taught Effie to read contracts and to bake biscuits with equal seriousness, who had died of a fever when Effie was 20 and left a space in the world that nothing had exactly filled since. He talked about his own loneliness since his father's death, not maudlin about it, just honest, the way he was about everything. He had a neighbor, a rancher named Pete Holloway, who ran cattle on the adjacent property, and Pete's wife Martha had been kind, but there was a specific loneliness that comes from living in a house where you have always lived with someone else, and he had been living with it since January. You shouldn't be alone in this house, she said. No, he said. I shouldn't. The ride back to town in the dark was quiet and easy, the horses knowing the road, the stars overhead in their full hill country excess, the warm night air carrying cedar and the distant river. At the hotel he helped her down again, And this time when his hand settled briefly at her waist, neither of them moved away immediately, and she looked up at him in the starlight. He kissed her the way he did everything without artifice or hurry, carefully and completely. And the world was very still for a moment, and the stars were all overhead, and the road smell of the Texas night was all around them. And it was the most honest kiss she had ever been given. When it ended, he rested his forehead briefly against hers and said nothing, because nothing was needed. "Saturday morning," she said softly. "Saturday morning," he said. She lay awake for a long time that night, not with the anxious wakefulness of the first night, but with the different, richer wakefulness of someone who has been given a great deal to think about and finds the thinking pleasurable. She had come here for a ranch. She was leaving with a lease agreement, a copy of Bleak House, and something considerably larger and more frightening and more wonderful than either. The stage came at 7 on Saturday. He was at the hotel at 6:30 with her bags already loaded. He had arranged it without being asked, just appeared in the lobby and said the bags were ready, and they had the half hour before departure standing together on the boardwalk with coffee from the hotel kitchen. "I'll ride to San Antonio in October," he said, "for the lease review and for—" He paused. "For you." "October," she said. "And I'll write before that," he said. "I'll write back," she said, "frequently. I am, as it turns out, quite good at written communication." "I had a feeling about that," he said. The stage driver called the boarding. She picked up her bag. He took her hand and held it for a moment, just that, just her hand in his, and looked at her with everything he was, all the steadiness and the honesty and the quiet fire that she had been watching since the auction yard, and it was enough. It was more than enough. "Go do your work," he said, "and come back. Come to me in October," she said. "And I will." She climbed into the stage. The driver clicked the horses forward. She watched Redemption Creek fall away behind them, the limestone buildings and the cedar hills, and the long south road that led eventually to the bend of the Llano River, and the ranch house with its roses and its live oak and its south porch looking toward the water. She opened her travel bag and put her hand on the spine of Bleak House and smiled to herself, privately, in the rocking stage coach on the road south to San Antonio. The letters started that same week. His first letter arrived 12 days after her return, written in a hand that was plain and clear and slightly cramped, as though the writer was more accustomed to working with tools than with pens. He wrote about the south pasture fence section that needed to be shored up before winter, and about the peregrine falcon having appeared again on the limestone face above the North Creek, and about a conversation he'd had with Pete Holloway about the water table. And at the very end, in language that was careful and somewhat formal and entirely sincere, he wrote that he found himself thinking of her at particular times of day, in the morning at the river, in the evening on the porch, and that he hoped she was well, and that October was not as far away as it seemed. She read it 3 times in the office on Commerce Street, and then wrote back 11 pages, which she was aware was not entirely proportionate, but did not particularly apologize for. They wrote through August and September with a regularity that became the rhythm of those months. She wrote about the other properties she was assessing, about a dispute with a land agent in Uvalde that she resolved in the company's favor through a combination of legal research and sheer tenacity, about her father who was beginning to understand that the Hill Country lease was a better arrangement than the outright purchase would have been. She wrote about San Antonio, the new railroad terminus, the water works being extended, the cattle market fluctuations, the ongoing and complicated political situation in Texas that was, in 1882, still sorting itself out from Reconstruction in ways that affected land ownership and water rights across the state. He wrote about the ranch, the fall work, the repairs, the cattle he was running on the north sections. He wrote about Redemption Creek's social life, with a dry, affectionate wit that surprised and delighted her. He wrote about what he was reading, which turned out to be a great deal, and their letters acquired a second register that was entirely literary. They argued about Dickens and about the new scientific work coming out of Europe, and about a novel she had sent him from San Antonio that he had found compelling but structurally flawed, an opinion she did not entirely share. He arrived in San Antonio on the 15th of October, on a horse he had ridden from Redemption Creek over 3 days, which she thought was characteristic. She met him at her father's house on King William Street, which was a solid brick house with a garden that her mother had designed, and that Effie maintained with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, was a man of 60 with her own sharp eyes and a deliberate manner of assessment that he had clearly passed directly to his daughter, and he looked Sela's Thatcher over in the front parlor with the unhurried thoroughness of a cattle buyer evaluating stock. "You managed to keep your ranch," Thomas said. "I did, sir," Sela said. "My daughter's decision to let the bid go was not the plan we had discussed," Thomas said. "No, sir, I understand that. But the lease arrangement she negotiated is a better return on capital than the purchase would have been, and it costs us nothing in management overhead," Thomas said, "so I have revised my position." "I'm glad to hear it, sir." Thomas looked at him steadily for another moment. "Are your intentions toward my daughter as clear as she seems to think they are?" "Father," Effie said. "Yes, sir," Sela said without hesitation. "They are." Thomas nodded once, apparently satisfied with the directness of the answer if not necessarily prepared to say so out loud, and excused himself to his study. Sela's looked at Effie. "I'm sorry about that," she said. "Don't be," he said. "I appreciate a man who asks the question plainly." He was in San Antonio for 10 days, during which time he and Effie walked every interesting part of the city: the Missions, the River Bend, the new commercial district, the market plaza where Mexican vendors had sold produce and goods for generations, and where the sounds and smells and colors were extraordinary. She showed him the company office on Commerce Street, introduced him to the staff with a composure that she could tell was noticed, and reviewed the lease paperwork with him formally for the records. But more than all of that, they were together in the way of two people who have been writing letters for months, and finally have the other person present in 3 dimensions. And the reality was considerably more than the correspondence had been, which had already been a great deal. They talked constantly about everything, about the company's 5-year plan and the ranch's grazing rotation and Texas politics and natural history, and the novels they'd been reading and the memory of a kiss in the starlight outside the Redemption Arms, about what they wanted their lives to look like. He asked her on the 8th evening, sitting on the garden bench under the pomegranate tree that her mother had planted, with the San Antonio evening warm around them and the sound of the city in the distance. He had thought about how to do it. She could see that he had brought the same careful deliberateness to this that he brought to fence lines and water rights, and he did not make it theatrical or overly elaborate, because that would not have been him. He simply said what he meant, in the direct, complete way that she had understood since the first morning in the hotel dining room was his most characteristic quality. He said that she was the most remarkable person he had met in 30 years on this earth, and that he had known it since she sat down across from him in the dining room and looked him in the eye and told him the truth. He said that the ranch and his work mattered deeply to him, and that he understood her work mattered equally to her, and that he had no intention of asking her to give any of it up. He said that San Antonio and Redemption Creek were 3 days apart, which was not impossible, and that the lease arrangement was a reasonable excuse for regular business between the 2 locations, and that he had spoken to Solomon Webb about the legal aspects of various arrangements. He said that he wanted to share his life with her, and that he hoped she wanted to share hers with him. And then he said, "Will you marry me, Effie?" The garden was quiet. The pomegranate tree shifted slightly in the evening air. Somewhere in the city, a bell was ringing the hour. She had known the answer since October 7th in the hotel dining room, though she had not fully admitted it to herself until approximately the 2nd letter. She had known it certainly since the starlight outside the hotel in Redemption Creek. She had known it the way she knew good land, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of evidence, clear and undeniable, that something was exactly what it needed to be. "Yes," she said, "I will." He took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that was unguarded and luminous, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a person who carried things alone was given permission to put them down. Thomas Whitfield, when informed the following morning over breakfast, set down his coffee cup and looked at his daughter and then at Sela's and then at his daughter again. "I expected this," he said. "Your mother would have liked him." It was, from Thomas Whitfield, an extraordinary statement. They were married in February of 1883 in Redemption Creek, at the Methodist church where they had first danced, with most of the town present and Mrs. Garza providing the wedding supper with an abundance and quality that rendered the occasion legendary in local memory for years afterward. Effie wore ivory silk practical enough for the weather, fine enough for the occasion, and carried a small bouquet from the rose bushes at the ranch house that Sela's had cut that morning before riding to town. Thomas Whitfield rode up from San Antonio for the ceremony and shook Sela's hand before the service with a firmness that communicated everything he was not going to say out loud. Harriet Lund, the notary, was in attendance, having been in the area for her circuit, and sat in the third pew looking pleased with the way her Thursday signing had concluded. Pete and Martha Holloway from the neighboring ranch were there, and Solomon Webb from Careville, and a good portion of Redemption Creek's population who had been present at the auction in August, and who had, in the way of small communities, been following the subsequent developments with considerable interest and investment. When Sela said his vows, he said them looking directly at Effie with the full, clear attention that had been his from the beginning, and his voice was steady and his meaning was complete, and she said her own vows in return with the same quality present, honest, certain. They moved into the ranch house together, with modifications discussed and planned over the months of correspondence and implemented in the weeks before the wedding. The kitchen garden was restored and expanded. The neglected south bedroom became a proper study for Effie, with shelves for her law books and survey maps, and a desk facing the window that looked east toward the Cedar Ridge. The lease paperwork from Whitfield Cattle Company acquired a new level of complexity because the lessee and the lessor's representative had merged households, a circumstance that both Solomon Webb and Thomas Whitfield found simultaneously amusing and legally interesting. Effie did not stop working for the company. This had been understood from the first and was not questioned. She rode to San Antonio 3 times in the first year of their marriage, managing the company's land acquisition work from a combination of her Redemption Creek study and the Commerce Street office, and discovered that the arrangement her father had initially accepted with resigned pragmatism turned out to work very well. She brought a more direct knowledge of hill country land conditions than any other analyst the company employed, and her negotiations with landowners were informed by her understanding of what a piece of ground meant to the people who had built their lives on it, which gave her an advantage that could not be taught in a classroom. Sela's ran the ranch with the same steady competence he had always brought to it, and the income from the Whitfield lease gave him the ability to make improvements he had been unable to afford: a new well, a rebuilt barn, better fencing on the north sections, a kitchen extension that doubled the working space in the house. In the evenings they sat on the south porch and watched the last light move across the river valley, and they talked about the day's work, about what they were reading, about the world beyond Redemption Creek, which was large and complex and changing rapidly even in 1883. The railroads were shifting everything about the cattle economy. The open range era was beginning, slowly and not without resistance, to give way to fenced pastures and changed ownership patterns. Effie watched it with the analytical attention of someone whose profession required her to think about what land would be worth in 5 years, and Sela's watched it with the knowledge of someone who had grown up in this country, and understood what was being lost in the changing as well as what was being gained. They were honest with each other about these things, and about everything. The honesty was the foundation of it, as it had been from the morning she sat down across from him in the hotel dining room and told him the truth she had not entirely planned to tell. In the spring of 1884, Effie realized she was expecting a child. She told Silas on a Tuesday evening on the south porch, with the river visible through the cedar and the evening star already showing in the west. She told him plainly, in the way she told him everything, watching his face. He was quiet for a moment, and the quality of his quiet was different from any she had seen before, not uncertain, not gathering itself, just very still, like a man who has received something almost too large to hold all at once. Then he reached over and took her hand and held it without speaking for a while, watching the river, and she felt the warmth of it through her entire self. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I'm very well," she said. He turned to look at her, and his face in the evening light had that luminous quality she had seen on the night he proposed, open and unguarded and entirely without reservation. "Good," he said. "That's the main thing." Their son was born in November of 1884, in the front room of the limestone house, the same room where Silas himself had been born 32 years earlier, with Martha Holloway attending, and a doctor from Careville who arrived at a brisk trot just in time to be useful. He was a solid, loud, healthy boy with dark hair and his father's steady way of looking at things, and they named him Edmund Thomas, for both grandfathers, which pleased Thomas Whitfield considerably when he arrived from San Antonio 3 weeks later to make his assessment. Thomas sat in the main room of the ranch house holding his grandson with the careful precision of a man who had not held an infant in some years and was not going to drop this one, and looked at his daughter over the baby's dark head with an expression that she had not seen on him since her mother was alive, stripped of all the professional armor, completely present. "Your mother," he said, and then stopped. "I know," Effie said. Edmund Thomas Thatcher grew, as infants do, with a speed that surprised his parents repeatedly. He was a curious child, mobile early and talkative early, with an enthusiasm for the outdoors that seemed entirely characteristic of someone born to it. By the time he was 2, he was following his father around the ranch with a seriousness of purpose that made the neighboring ranchers laugh, and his mother watch with a fullness in her chest that she had not known she was capable of. Silas was, as a father, exactly what Effie had expected him to be: present, patient, honest with the child in the same way he was honest with everyone. He read to him in the evenings from the books on the shelf, including eventually from Bleak House, which was perhaps ambitious for a 3-year-old, but which Edmund sat through with an attention that suggested he was taking in more than was immediately apparent. The years in Redemption Creek found their rhythm. The lease with Whitfield Cattle Company ran smoothly, renewed annually with the quiet efficiency of an agreement that worked well for everyone. The ranch prospered, modestly and sustainably, which was the only kind of prosperity that hill country land supports over time, and the only kind that Silas had ever wanted. Effie's work for the company continued to evolve. By 1885, she was managing the company's entire land acquisition strategy from Redemption Creek, with twice-yearly visits to San Antonio for the formal board review. She had, in the course of her work, developed a reputation in Texas land circles that was entirely professional and considerable, and she had navigated the specific indignities of doing serious work in a world that was not entirely sure women should be doing serious work with the same combination of competence and quiet determination she had always brought to the subject. There were still land agents who addressed their correspondence to her father rather than to her. There were still bankers who explained basic legal concepts to her that she understood better than they did. There were still occasions when she walked into a negotiating room and had to wait for the men to recalibrate their expectations before the actual work could begin. She was patient with this, on the outside. On the inside, she was considerably less patient, and had a number of things she said to Sila's on the south porch in the evenings about it that were precise and direct and occasionally profane. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he had given her since the beginning, and said useful things back, and occasionally made her laugh so hard about a specific incident that it lost its power to irritate her, which she valued enormously. In 1886, their daughter was born, a spring baby, April-born, named Clara for Effie's mother, and for no other reason than that it was right. Clara was different from Edmund in all the fundamental temperamental ways that siblings often are, where he was deliberate and physical. She was quick and verbal, talking with precision before she was 2 and already, by 3, appropriating her mother's survey maps to draw her own landscape records on the back of them. "She's going to be trouble," Silas said. "She's going to be wonderful," Effie said. "Those are the same thing," he said. In the summer of 1887, Harlan Creed's bank failed. It had been heading in that direction for some time, built on the kind of over-leveraged speculation that the 1880s cattle economy had made temporarily invisible, and that the subsequent downturns had made painfully clear. Creed left Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning without particularly announcing his departure, and the town that he had dominated financially for the better part of a decade spent a few weeks in the practical complications of his absence, and then got on with things, as small towns do. Silas received the news with a quietness that was different from his usual quiet. That evening on the porch, he looked out at the river for a long time. "Are you thinking about the auction?" He said. "I'm thinking about my father," he said. "He borrowed money in good faith from a man who had no intention of keeping good faith. He paused. "That's an injustice that doesn't get undone just because the man's bank failed." "No," she said, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a while, the cedar-smelling evening around them, the children's voices from inside the house where Martha Holloway had them for the afternoon. "The ranch is whole," Silas said finally. "The debt is paid. The land is what it was." "And more," she said. He looked at her. "It's more than it was," she said. "Edmund Thatcher built something extraordinary, and you kept it. And now there are children running around in the house who are going to grow up knowing this ground and this river and these cedar hills the way you do. That's not nothing, Silas. That's everything." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached over and drew her close against his side, his arm around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and the river moved through the trees in the late light, and the evening star came up, and the world was all right. The years continued in their accumulation. By 1889, Edmund was 4 and Clara was 3, and Effie was expecting again, another boy, as it turned out, born in November and named James after Solomon Webb's suggestion that the name would age well, which turned out to be true. James was a cheerful, rounded baby who smiled at everyone with a democratic warmth that made strangers feel immediately at ease, and made his parents suspect that he was going to grow up to be either a very good politician or a very good salesman, and that the two options were probably not distinct. Thomas Whitfield came up to see the new baby and stayed for 3 weeks, which was longer than he had ever stayed before, and spent most of it on the south porch watching the river with Silas, the two of them talking in the way that men who respect each other talk when they have run out of reasons to be cautious honestly, at length, about what mattered. Effie watched them from the kitchen garden and thought about her mother, and about how much she would have loved this house, this porch, this river, these children, this man. She thought she probably knew, in whatever way the dead know things. Pete and Martha Holloway's daughter had married the previous spring, and their son was beginning to take over the operation of the adjacent ranch, and the two families continued the neighborly partnership that had sustained both properties through drought years and cattle market downturns, with the flexible, practical loyalty of people who understood that they needed each other. The community of Redemption Creek had grown somewhat. A new schoolhouse had been built in 1886, and the church had expanded its building, and there was now a proper bank operating on principles that were more conservative than Harlan Creed's had been, and a second general store. The railroad had come through Careville, and the ripple effects of it were changing the economics of the whole region in ways both productive and disruptive. Silas watched all of it with the thoughtful attention of a man who had seen what happened when change came faster than communities could manage, and who was not reflexively against change, but was particular about what he would give ground on and what he would not. The land and the water were not negotiable. The relationships with neighbors were not negotiable. The education of his children was not negotiable. He had opinions about the new schoolhouse and contributed significantly to its construction and to the quality of its teacher, a young man from Virginia who had come west for his health and stayed for the country, and who turned out to be excellent with children. Effie handled the schoolhouse committee's legal work, because she was the most qualified person in 3 townships to do so, and she served on the county water board in a capacity that was technically advisory and practically decisive. And she continued her work for the company with the consistent excellence that had built her reputation over the decade. Thomas Whitfield had formally transferred the land acquisition division of the company to her management in 1887, an arrangement that the rest of the board had accepted with varying degrees of comfort, but that Thomas had made non-negotiable, because his daughter was the most capable person in the organization, and he had made the professional errors earlier in his life of not saying so plainly enough, and did not intend to repeat them. She and Silas talked about all of it always, on the south porch in the evenings, and at the table in the mornings, and riding the fence lines in the afternoons. They had conversations that went on for days, picking up threads and setting them down and returning to them, the ongoing conversation of 2 people who found each other inexhaustibly interesting. They argued sometimes, not often and not bitterly, but genuinely, with the friction that comes from 2 people who are both certain and both accustomed to being right. They argued about the company's expansion into the Panhandle, which she favored and he was uncertain about. They argued about the schoolhouse teacher's curriculum, which he thought was too conservative, and she thought was pitched exactly right. They argued about the new fence line on the east section and whether it was in the right position, which turned out to be a dispute they both had strong technical opinions about and which required measuring. They were also, in those years, deeply and continuously in love in the way that is not dramatic and is all the more real for it. The love that is made of daily choices to be present, to be honest, to tend what matters, to show up fully for someone not only in the large moments, but in the ordinary ones that constitute most of a life. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, a February evening with the Cedar Hills blue dark against a winter sky and the fire going in the main room, Silas put the children to bed and came back downstairs to find Effie on the south porch with her coat on and a cup of tea, looking at the dark river and the stars over the limestone ridge. He brought his own cup and sat beside her in the winter quiet. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. Do you know what I was thinking about tonight? Tell me. I was thinking about the auction, she said, about standing there with my paddle and doing the arithmetic. I had exactly $16,000 in authorization, and you bid $16,000 and the paddle didn't move. I know, he said. I've never told you what I was thinking at that moment, she said. The exact thing. What were you thinking? She turned to look at him in the winter dark, this man who had built his life on honesty and steadiness and the refusal to let what mattered be taken away without a fight. I was thinking that whatever I came here for, this was not it, and it was better, she said. Just that. This is better. He set his cup down and put his arm around her, and she leaned into the warmth of him, and the Texas night was cold and clear and vast overhead, and the river moved in its dark bend below the cedar ridge. And inside the house, their 3 children were sleeping in the rooms that his father had built in 1849 with $40 and a mule, and the particular stubborn faith that what you build with honest hands will last. It is better, he said. Every day it is. She turned her face up to his, and he kissed her there on the south porch in the February dark. And it had the same quality it had always had: careful, complete, honest, full of meaning that did not need to be translated into anything other than itself. In the spring of that 10th year, 1893, they planted a new rosebush by the front steps, a companion to the one his mother had planted 40-odd years before, which still bloomed every June with an extravagance that seemed to express an opinion about endurance. The new one was a different variety, deeper in color, and they planted it together on a Saturday morning with Edmund, now 9, and Clara, now 7, and James, now 4, all present and offering opinions on the proper depth of the planting hole, which produced a lively and democratic debate that Silas refereed with barely concealed amusement. When the rosebush was in the ground and the children had dispersed to their various morning projects, and the two of them stood in the spring yard with the limestone house behind them, and the river visible through the greening cedar trees and the sky an April blue overhead, Effie put her hand in Silas's and looked at what they had. The ranch was whole. The debt was long paid. The land was as good as it had been when Edmund Thatcher first walked it, and better in some ways, because it had been known and cared for over time by people who understood that to love a piece of ground was to work for it, not just on it. The children would grow up here, and would carry it in them the way Silas carried his father's 30 years, not as weight but as foundation. The company's lease on the south pasture, renewed every year with the quiet efficiency of an agreement that had become, over the decade, something more than a business arrangement. It was the shape of how two lives had been joined, the legal document that had kept them in each other's orbit long enough for everything else to follow. And in the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the river and talk. And the talking would be easy and interesting and full of the particular warmth of two people who had chosen each other completely and kept choosing every day. Thomas Whitfield came every summer now, and his health was less than it had been, but his mind was entirely intact, and he and Edmund had developed a friendship that Effie watched with profound gratitude, the old man's sharp eyes finding their echo in his grandson's, the particular angle of inquiry passing through generation to generation. Thomas had said the previous summer, sitting in the shade of the big live oak with little James on his lap and a glass of lemonade in hand, that he had not expected his life to arrange itself this well, and that he was glad it had, and the sentiment, for Thomas Whitfield, was equivalent to a speech. The afternoon of that 10th spring anniversary, Silas saddled the two horses as he had that first Sunday in August of 1882, and they rode north to the fork of the creek, and tied the horses in the shade, and sat on the limestone shelf above the water where they had sat the first time, with the cedar all around, and the peregrine falcon visible on its ledge above, unchanging and magnificent. He had brought coffee again, in the same battered tin pot wrapped in cloth, and cornbread that was better than the first cornbread had been, the recipe having been refined over 10 years of practice. She ate the cornbread and drank the coffee and looked at the water moving over the pale stone, and she thought about everything: the paddle lowered in the auction yard, the dining room table, the North Fork in August sunlight, the dancing, the first letter, the garden in San Antonio, the vows in the Methodist church, the 3 children in the limestone house, the years and their accumulation. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That it was a very good business decision," she said. He looked at her with the expression that had been one of the first things she understood about him, and that she had never tired of: the warmth and the dry humor and the full, direct attention of a man who was entirely present. "The lease," he said. "Letting the paddle go," she said. He smiled, the full smile, not the half-reserved one from the early days, but the one that had arrived over time and stayed. That meant he was entirely himself and entirely happy. And the afternoon light came through the cedar and lay warm on the limestone, and the creek moved over its pale stones, and the peregrine lifted from its ledge and crossed the blue sky overhead in a long, easy arc. "The best business decision you ever made," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and watched the falcon until it was gone over the cedar ridge, and the creek ran on below them, and the afternoon was theirs, and it was more than enough. It was everything.